Hello, and welcome to the Egyptology Graduate Student Association Spring Lecture, The Mysteries of Theban Tomb 16. My name is Nicole Gregory, President of the EGSA, and I am here to introduce to you Dr. Suzanne Onstein as our lecturer. Dr. Onstein is an associate professor in the Egyptology graduate program in the Department of History at the University of Memphis. Having gained her PhD at the University of Toronto, she has interests in social history, women and gender, New Kingdom, Third Intermediate Period, Late Period, and the Pre-Dynastic Period of Ancient Egypt. She is a faculty advisor for the EGSA and a founding board member of the Tennessee chapter of the American Research Center in Egypt. Over many projects and publications, Dr. Onstein is also the director of the University of Memphis mission to Theban Tomb 16 of Pinhesi. Today, she will detail to us how her team has been working in T16, a project that started in 2008. Dr. Onstein and her team studied the 19th dynasty tomb and its secondary burials using epigraphy, archaeology, and forensics. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Onstein in her presentation, The Mysteries of Theban Tomb 16.
Thank you for that introduction, and thank you to the Egyptology Graduate Student Association for inviting me to give this talk in their annual lecture series. So today I'm going to give you an overview of work in Theban Tomb 16 that the University of Memphis has undertaken since 2008. And so we'll deal with all the different research phases that we've gone through, some of the highlights of things that we've found, and give you a sort of impression of the life cycle of this monument. So Theban Tomb 16 is part of a giant cemetery of non-royal tombs in Thebes on the west bank of modern Luxor. In the map here, you can see the Theban area circled and a little breakaway section which shows the nobles' tombs, or the tombs of these elite bureaucrats, mostly from the New Kingdom, and their cemeteries. TT16 lies in an area called Drab al-Naga, which is at the northern end of this necropolis on the road to visit Dar al-Bahri, if you're familiar with the landscape. This whole cemetery has hundreds of tombs belonging to elite officials, and during the initial investigations of this necropolis, numbers were given to tombs because not all of them had names or recorded inscriptions in them still. And it helped to sort of organize efforts at recording and documenting them. You can see here that the tomb lies in a very dynamic landscape. Before we started working here, 2007 and before, there was a very active village all around the tomb. And the tomb you can see circled there with a pink circle right in the middle of some houses and alabaster factories. And in 2007, the Egyptian government carried out a campaign which removed much of the village, nearly all of the village, except for a few of the alabaster factories right along the road. And in fact, those two in the picture there are still operational today, but the rest of the houses are gone. And you can see in the right slide that the tomb courtyard is now cleared, and above it there's no more house. There's no more village around it, and the work that we've done has been largely in an environment where this landscape of the past was already gone. So just to give you a brief orientation to the timeline that we're dealing with here for the whole life cycle. It began in the 19th dynasty when Pa-Nessi and his wife made their House of Eternity sometime during the reign of Ramses II. So that's about 1250 BCE. And then after their burial, their tomb was reused for secondary burials from the Third Intermediate Period onward up into the Late Period and Ptolemaic era, perhaps even the Roman period. So we have a very rich ancient history, but we also know some about how it has been dealt with in the modern sense. We know that it has been looted in the modern era, although the chronology of it is unclear. We have some clues, which I'll talk about as we go along. One of the first clues to be uncovered was obviously the sort of historiographic research that we do when we start any project. And Porter and Moss says that only one room of this tomb was accessible because the rest of it was blocked up with debris. And this is also confirmed by the epigraphers from the French Institute, who in the late 1920s published the first room and the epigraphic drawings of it, also stating that the second room and the corridor, which they didn't mention specifically, but that everything beyond the first room was in fact inaccessible. We know that conservation and clearance was done of this second room, as well as the wall reliefs throughout the tomb, sometime probably in the 1950s, based on the style of conservation used. A mud plaster was used, which fell out of favor a long time ago. And we know from local people that doors were put on the tomb in the 1980s, but prior to that, they stood open. And in particular, this one was definitely open. So we have a number of facts that we can bring into play when we think about reconstructing how the tomb got to be in the state that it's in and what kinds of factors have acted upon it. So here's our architectural plan of the entire structure. You can see that there's a courtyard in front, and in fact there are still the remains of some of the ancient mud brick that delineated it. There are stairs down. Well, I should say there are modern stairs down during that 1950s conservation, a cement series of steps, just a few steps down, and a cement floor was put into the tomb, and we don't know what is underneath it in particular, but it's just a few steps down into a broad hall and then a long hall, neither of which are very large. And in fact, if you're over 6 feet tall, you're going to hit your head in a number of places. Then at the very back, there's a corridor that leads deeper into the hillside that is rough cut, ending in a burial chamber. And this burial passage, this whole corridor, is where all of the secondary burials were found. All of these looted bodies and their broken funerary equipment come from this section of the tomb. The original owners were Pa-Nessie and Ta-Renu, pictured here. Pa-Nessie was an overseer of the chanters of the offering table of Amun and a priest of Amenhotep of the forecourt, which is a form of Amenhotep I, deified afterlife. And his wife was a chantress of Amun. So both of them worked for the religious hierarchy, probably at Karnak, performing as part of the rites of the temple. So in Pa-Nessie's job as an overseer of chanters at the offering table of Amun, he was responsible for leading processions like this one out of the temple, which is depicted here to the right, where they bring out sacred vessels or sacred images for people in the village to access the god because they weren't allowed inside the temple. So this likely represents a pretty common occurrence in the Theban landscape, and Pa-Nessie's job was to announce the coming of the god so that people could come out of their houses and view the god, perhaps to interact with it in some way, receive the blessings of the god from the priests. A whole retinue of priests follows behind with what appear to be libation offerings, vessels for pouring out water, perhaps. And so this whole scene really is Pa-Nessie depicting himself doing his job. And the temple there on the right, I think, is probably Karnak Temple. Of course, in Thebes, the cult of Amun is the biggest thing going. And Karnak Temple is the center of the worship of Amun. So if you're associated with the cult of Amun, it makes sense that you are probably associated with Karnak. The 4 flagstaffs depicted on the temple correspond to the Ramesside era pylon as well. And so we have an indication of a real thing that happened, not an idealized landscape or activity, but a real thing that happened to Pa-Nessie that he wanted to commemorate in his tomb. And in terms of the actual landscape of the tomb, this northern side of the necropolis is directly across from Karnak. So if we were to walk up the hill to get a little height, we could see across the river and see Karnak really quite easily. So the other title that Pa-Nessie held was as a priest in the cult of Amenhotep of the forecourt and Pa-Weba. The cult of the deified Amenhotep I took on a few forms in the Ramesside period. It was very popular, and we have a number of different manifestations. This particular one seems to be associated with the Oracle of Amenhotep. And this oracle took the form of the statue. And you can see in this picture a statue and a throne, a golden gilded throne, the carrying poles of a palanquin that the priests would have held as they carried him through the village. This statue was the focal point of a cult kind of worship in which people from the village could ask questions of the god, questions about daily life, questions about criminal activity, pretty much anything that they hoped that they could receive advice from the other side about. And it was the job of priests like Pa-Nessie to interpret the movements of the statue as how the god was responding to these questions. So in this case, again, we have another object that was probably a real thing. There are many representations of this particular statue from other tombs and other objects from the Theban area. So we have a second observation of Pa-Nessie recording his real life and not idealized versions of an afterlife he wanted to live. So we're starting to get the picture that Pa-Nessie is a really pious person who loved his job, who felt a calling for both of these titles that he held. So Amenhotep and Ahmose-Nefertari, his also deified mother, are shown in a few places in the tomb, and they're actually the focal point of the decorative program. When you first walk in, the thing that you see is that image of the statue and the palanquin, and right underneath it, the scene on the left of the deified royals in a kiosk. So they have the pride of place, giving you the idea that this is a very important part of his life. And as you look down into the tomb in the second room, there are two other images, one of Amenhotep and one of Ahmose-Nefertari. So even as you look into the tomb, your eye is drawn to the back wall where the royals are shown again. So the popularity of the cult in Ramesside times meant that there were a number of people who felt extremely devoted to Amenhotep and his mother Ahmose-Nefertari and chose to depict these individuals in their tombs. But it might also be these representations that caused Third Intermediate Period and later people to reuse this tomb, because the cult of Amenhotep continued to be popular into the Third Intermediate Period. So we have an indication of a sort of wider community phenomenon from the representations of the deities, the kings and the queen in the tomb, and these secondary burials. So we have a number of challenges in this second room. There's a great deal of smoke damage that obscures some areas of the decorative program. So I'm giving you here the photo of the wall as it appears and the epigraphic drawing that we did in our early seasons of work. So this depicts Ahmose-Nefertari receiving incense and libation offering from Pa-Nessie. And so you can see when you're up close at the wall a lot of the details which are not visible in the photograph, just like this. So the process that we used of digital epigraphy, using digital photos and Photoshop and a Wacom drawing tablet, really yielded very good results and was a way to document the tomb quickly. Every year we were unsure whether we would have money to come back or get permission to come back. And so in the first couple of years, we really tried to get as much epigraphic drawing done as possible. Now, when we do the conservation and are able to clean some of the soot off the walls, we'll go back and do a second round of it, hopefully with new details becoming evident after cleaning. But I just wanted to give you an indication of what some of our work processes have been over time. So this scene back in the first room parallels the palanquin scene. It's immediately to the left of the axis of the tomb. The palanquin's on the right. So when you walk in, you see the palanquin, Ahmose and Nefertari and Amenhotep, and then on the other side, you see this image of Pa-Nessie offering in front of a temple. Now, the temple is just called Per Amun-Ra, but for a number of reasons, which I'll explain, I believe that this depicts the funerary temple of Amenhotep I. So the first clue is that in the inscription, Amenhotep I of the forecourt and Pa-Nessie's relationship as a priest of this cult is the only title mentioned. He doesn't mention his title as an overseer of chanters. In the previous slide that you saw of that procession, he only mentions his chanter title. He doesn't mention Amenhotep at all. So there's a clear sort of division between the two jobs that he held. Additionally, if you look at the way that the scene is laid out, Pa-Nessie is shaven in a priestly garb. The offerings are very regular. There's 4 tables, each holding the same thing. So 3 bread and a duck. This really feels very much like what would be given in a daily offering. So a daily offering would have been a sort of regularized or a standardized set of offerings given to the god every day. And the priest would have been responsible for doing the rites to open the shrine, to provide some incense, to clear out any insects and any sort of bad smells, and then offer fresh food, fresh libations, water to the god, and then clean it all up and sweep on the way out. So this scene really looks very much like the carrying out of the daily offering. The temple itself, being labeled a Per Amun-Ra, is also interesting because we know that funerary temples could be called Per Amun. So that's not unusual. We don't have to assume that this is an Amun temple like Karnak just because it's called the Per Amun. The 2 temples are depicted differently, so there's an attempt by the artist to distinguish between the 2, so it's not the same temple. This one lacks the flags on the flagstaffs, and the flagstaffs themselves have details on it that show perhaps gilding or bark left on. Unclear exactly what is meant, but there's an attempt for a difference to be made. The parallelism with the placement of the palanquin scene, its prominence of place, and its difference from the other temple are all significant facts. And the one thing that you can't see in the tomb that's sort of the cherry on the top of this sundae is that the actual remains of the temple of Amenhotep I are just across the street. So he buried himself near his workplace. He depicted his workplace inside. He was clearly a very devout person. The pink square here is an indication of where that temple is. This plan done by Howard Carter way back in the day depicts a landscape that, it doesn't really look like that anymore. There's modern roads and so on around. The star indicates Pa-Nessie's tomb, and right in front of it, that dotted line is where the modern road to Dar el-Bahri is today, and the dotted line that runs sort of horizontally across the stream through the pink square is about where the road from the Ramesseum around to meet up with the Valley of the Kings Road goes by there. And in between, there's this sort of island of desert that obviously is antiquities land. Nobody's building on it or using it. So when I say across the street, it's really just a few minutes walk across from the tomb to the temple. Now, you might be surprised because you've been to Egypt and you didn't see any Temple of Amenhotep I. Well, that's because it's all underground. And even in the late 1800s, Spiegelberg, who excavated the site, didn't find more than a few blocks, which thankfully had inscriptions on them that indicated that this was, in fact, the mortuary temple of Amenhotep I, with concessions made to Ahmosa Nefertari, her name found there as well. It should be noted that there are also other remains of Amenhotep I in this area of Dar el-Bahri, shrines along the causeway, and perhaps underneath the temple of Thutmose III. So there's still a lot of sort of other possibilities, but his main mortuary temple clearly was right there at the edge of cultivation. And Pa-Nessie chose this location probably because of its nearness to the temple. Another factor, which may or may not have been known to him, is that the candidates for what was Amenhotep I's tomb also lie in this area. So there are three main contenders. KV 39, which is sort of an oddball, not in the valley proper, has been long theorized as a possibility. It seems to be very early 18th dynasty, doesn't follow the model of the rest of the tombs, and so there's indications that it could be Amenhotep I's tomb. But there are other things that have been excavated along the way that also are contenders. One of them was found by Howard Carter, called AN-B, and is basically a shaft that many people now think could have been Ahmosa Nefertari's tomb, and that when all of the royals were moved during the episode recorded in the Tomb Robberies Papyri, when the kings and queens were reburied in a cache, that this was emptied out. So there's not an indication specifically of Ahmosa Nefertari having been there, other than early 18th dynasty remains. And then the German Institute, which has been excavating north of where we are in TT16, has been investigating all the unnumbered tombs in Dar el-Naga, and one that they call K9311 seems to have been a very large early 18th dynasty tomb that was reused in Ramesside times. And the Ramesside era material seems to associate this tomb with the cult of Amenhotep I. And so there's some reason to believe that at least by the Ramesside period, they might have believed that that was the tomb of Amenhotep, whether it was or not. So we have all of these different sort of possibilities still in this northern section of the necropolis near Pa-Nessie's tomb, like literally right up the ridge at the top of the Theban cliffs. Let's turn to some of the other decoration in the tomb. We have a number of really nice scenes. Some of them have been damaged by looting. Some of them have even older damage, which was repaired in the 50s with that mud plaster restoration. And here you can see an overview of the northern section of the first room with a depiction in the center there of Pa-Nessie and Ta-Renu worshiping in front of a sort of blank space. And in that blank space, you can see that on the edge there's sort of white semicircular things. Those are actually meant to be stela that are placed in the mountainside. And then there's this red sort of dotted background, which indicates desert or mountain. And up at the top of the scene, you can just see the plumes and some papyrus fronds. And so these are all elements that we know are part of the Hathor coming from the mountain motif. The picture down below is the epigraphic drawing of the French Institute, showing what this wall looked like in the 1920s when they were in the tomb. So the damage to the tomb is definitely post their intervention, and in some areas the looting actually cuts into the restoration, which was done in the 50s or 60s. So we know that the looting was done after the restoration. And also, if you were going to do restoration, why would you leave big gaping holes like this? So it's clear that this happened after that restoration process. On the right of the scene, you see the goddess coming out of the tree, pouring water for the deceased, and the ba of the deceased sitting in the shade of the tree. And so this is a really nice package of images. Underneath it is that scene of the procession out of the temple. And so this combination of daily life and religious scenes that are typical of the Ramesside age gives you a nice variety of scenes. During our first season of excavation in 2011, we were lucky enough to discover this chunk of plaster in the middle of the Hathor cow that matches this scene. When we first went into the tomb, we found a big crate that had a lot of plaster pieces, and these other two pieces that you see replaced here are from that crate of stuff that had been laying around and presumably collected by the people who cleared out the second room. But they obviously didn't do any clearance in the corridor where the looted remains of the human remains and the bodies are. So when we started to do the clearance of that, we came across Hathor. And so we're able to, in the future, replace these pieces in the wall where they go. So we have Hathor, we have a chunk of the offering stand that stands in front of her, as well as another piece of mountainside with a tomb stela in it representing the necropolis. So Hathor here in her guise as a goddess of the West and as a goddess of the necropolis is being worshipped by Pa-Nessie and Ta-Renu. There's more. There's a second scene of Hathor coming out of the mountain. It is also, unfortunately, very destroyed, and it's in the second room, so it has this thick layer of soot on it, so you can't really see it. The picture on the right might not be very clear to you, so the drawing on the left should give you an indication that it is, in fact, a desert mountainside with papyrus clump. And then in front of that, there's this big empty space. But right in front of that empty space, then, are the remains of feet facing towards this scene. So a worshiper in an attitude of being oriented towards this scene, again, seems very much like a Hathor emerging from the mountain scene. I have no idea why there are two, but there are also two tree goddesses. So the reduplication in each room is unusual, and they do seem to be done by different artists. They have different styles. So there are a lot of things to consider in this tomb, just thinking about the artistic process and the choices that were made in making a tomb. Just to refresh your memory about that first room's tree goddess scene, here it is in an undamaged state, pre-1965. This is from an art history book that was published in about 1965. And then on the right, then, the damage done by the looters. And one of the plaster fragments, which we discovered in that crate of plaster fragments, is actually his hand and scepter, which we can replace during our restoration phase. The tree goddess seen in the second room suffered from some of the smoke damage, but thankfully not all of it. And here you can see the seated couple in front of the tree goddess leaning out of it to pour libations into golden goblets that they hold. And the details of the tree fascinate me for a number of reasons. But the main one is that the tree actually sits within this sort of built-up white container, as if it's a potted plant. This white container is probably a mud brick berm that helped to retain water around the roots of the tree, because the sycamore needs a lot of water. The sycamore tree is associated with this kind of refreshment of the dead because not only does it give really good shade and delicious fruit, but there's always water close by. This is not a desert tree, and so it was only possible for it to live with human intervention. It needed to be watered, it needed to be tended. So this was a common feature of many gardens, probably. So it had this status of being not just a decorative tree, but also a useful one in that it helped retain water in your environment around your house and provided then cooling shade underneath it. Another of my favorite aspects of the tomb is the humor inside. This top scene depicts a harvest scene. The grain is being cut and then loaded on a donkey. The donkey's handler has a stick raised as if he's about to beat it, and the poor donkey has his mouth open as if he's braying. And we know that in ancient Egyptian artistic conventions, an open mouth represents an attempt to convey sound. And we all know that the soundtrack of ancient Egypt must have been donkey noises, because donkeys are loud. And so the inclusion of this particular aspect of daily life really gives you more sense of the individuality of Pa-Nessie. He's portrayed his job in a couple of different ways. He's portrayed his wife in many scenes, and now he's portraying the sort of life of the estate or the life of the land in a very funny way. Underneath that scene, there's a scene of plowing, and the cows have decided to go on strike. At least one of them has laid down, and the other one is resisted being wrangled into submission by a farmhand. And in what might be the world's first side-eye, all of the cows are looking off as if they are completely exasperated with the situation. Our secondary burials in the corridor were cleared out over several seasons, and during this time, we estimate that there may be over 100 people represented by the remains found there. Nearly equal numbers of men and women, and also many children. In the fill associated with these looted human remains are the associated burial goods, all broken up and ripped apart during the unbandaging process and the looting process. So we have a ton of linen, a whole bunch of mud-backed plaster coffin pieces. And what I mean by that is that many of the coffins were actually molded out of a thick layer of mud, which was then plastered and painted. So rather than making a true cartonnage, which we also have, these mud-backed plaster coffins were actually way more common. We have wood from coffins and boxes. We have shabtis, beads, amulets, scarabs, that kind of stuff. Most of the coffin fragments date to Dynasty 21-22, as do the shabtis. Stylistically, we have a lot of information, even from the broken stuff. So we feel pretty confident that the secondary burials are largely a third intermediate period phenomenon, with some also happening later. Now, the interesting thing is what's missing from the fill. So all of these broken pieces would have represented an original burial. And in an original burial of the Third Intermediate Period, we would expect to find a Book of the Dead, maybe wooden stela, all kinds of other things accompanying the body, which we simply don't find in Theban Tomb 16. These are the kinds of things that you find on the art market and in museums. So the Book of the Dead, papyri, and wooden stela are small portable things that are easily trafficked, and so I believe that's why they're missing from the corpus of artifacts that we've found. In this next section of the talk, I'll be dealing with human remains. So I just want to give you a warning that if you are sensitive to viewing human remains, mummified, skeletonized, archaeological human remains, that this may be a good time to switch off. And in fact, the image that's on right now is what the tomb looked like when we first encountered it, which was basically a floor strewn with looted body parts and linen that had been torn off of the people who had been buried there. So these secondary burials are they're not even burials anymore. It's all just limbs higgledy-piggledy all over, torn up, broken pieces, and the looters basically went after all of the small saleable things that would have been inside the body, and those mud coffins wouldn't have withstanded being broken into to get the mummy out. So there was really probably no way that they could have been saved breaking into him to get to the body, to unwrap it and get at any gold, jewelry, amulets, all that kind of stuff that would have been in the bandages of the mummy. So when we were doing our initial clearance, we noticed that there were concentrations of body parts in some areas related to the architecture of the tomb itself. And so in the places where there's good headroom for standing up and sitting down and a wide flat place to work, we found huge concentrations of this material. So it's clear that the looters sat down in the tomb and did their work there, as well as at the very entrance to the corridor where the light would have been good and the air would have been fresher. So there's no traditional stratigraphy to speak of here, but the horizontal stratigraphy speaks to that process of looting. The looting reduced people to basically piles of broken bones like this. I have an amazing team working for me at the site, human remains specialist Jesus Herrerin, a physical anthropologist, as well as Miguel Sanchez, a paleopathologist, who together looked at literally every single bone. No matter how small, they analyzed it, and if there were significant findings about it, a pathology, an unusual feature, diagnostic bits, where you could tell the sex or age of an individual, they recorded those, but they did look at every single piece. This was a huge job, and we added another physical anthropologist, Natasha Sarkic, just to keep up with this process. We've been trying to estimate a minimum number of individuals for the tomb for these secondary burials. It seems like it's between 100 and 200 people. We're not quite finished with our analysis yet. Where we did have larger pieces of human remains, still somewhat mummified or still somewhat intact, we found a lot of strange things. And I like to say throughout this project that forget everything you know about mummification, because there's just too many variants going on. Many of these seem to be related to the idea of trying to perfect the body for the afterlife. And we called this prosthesis for the afterlife because it usually involved amending or modifying the body in such a way as to change it, to make it stronger, more stable, whole, repaired. It covered a number of different phenomena. And so when we came across bodies like this, which is essentially just a torso, rib cage, spinal column, there was a stick running all the way through the spinal column. And then we found another and another. What do you do with this? Clearly it wasn't an accident. It was clearly something that had been done in antiquity, because the pieces of the spine had been mummified and, solidified into a flat state. Your spine is normally an S curve. And so if the body had not been, dealt with in this way, the spinal cord would have preserved some of that curve. But the ones with the stick in it, perfectly flat. Obviously, during the mummification process, this stick was meant to, help the mummy, the person, sit up straight, help to stabilize the torso, and perhaps it was also addressing some kind of illness like arthritis, which was probably the case in one of them, who had some very visible signs of arthritis in the upper vertebrae. So this practice manifested in many different ways, not just the sticks through the spine. This pelvis may not look like much, but it actually tells a very important story. It's a pelvis not found connected to anything else, but when you look closely, you can see that the two pieces have actually been tied together with a piece of linen string or a piece of fabric. And so this was kind of a shocker. The physical anthropologist and the paleopathologist both looked at this and determined that it was a pelvis belonging to a young woman, and that the only way that this string could get there was that it had been introduced, obviously, during the mummification process. And then we started asking a lot of questions. Why? Yeah, a normal mummification would never interfere with this area of the body. And our paleopathologist actually, I believe, came up with the idea first that perhaps the pelvis had been broken, that the ligament that holds the two pieces together had been broken while trying to remove a fetus stuck in the birth canal, or removing an unborn child from a woman who had died near to the time of childbirth or during childbirth. And so the idea about this kind of grew because it's really a puzzle why embalmers would do this. But if you think about antiquity and the precariousness of childbirth and how many women must have died as a result of childbirth, the care that was given to this woman in repairing her pelvis really represents such a human gesture, that repairing her meant that in the afterlife she could be fully female, that she could bear children, that she could conceive and bear children. Restoring the anatomical position of the pelvis was part of this prosthesis idea that aimed to create a perfected whole body, able to function in the afterlife as the best version of yourself. So this really, it sort of speaks to me of a community of care that the embalmers were part of, that they may have known the person or known the family that this woman belonged to, and that they wanted the best for her in the afterlife. And of course, there's a whole industry around this, and the parents who are paying for the embalming could have asked for this to be done. And there's all kinds of speculations we can do about the motives that we will never know, but it kind of puts a human face on this aspect of women dying in childbirth. We rarely see like the actual bodily evidence of it. We know that it happened, and we know that this was an extremely anxious time during any woman's life because she knew that it was a possibility. But to find a dramatic example where it may have happened and that the mortuary industry dealt with that seems to be a really a sort of kindness that speaks to us across all of these generations. There are many more things that I could talk about discovered in the tomb, small finds and other scientific testing that we would like to do, and some that we're currently carrying out, like archaeobotany, but there just isn't time. This tomb literally has so many different facets to it for investigation that it's still going to take a few more years to analyze all of our finds, as well as deal with the restoration and conservation of the materials and the wall surfaces. So we still have years left of work in the tomb. We're a small team, and we usually work only 6 to 8 weeks out of the year. So pace is slow, but we will get there in the end. And just a final note about the burials. They're still in the tomb, still in TT16, awaiting further analysis, and there's no plans to move them out to be stored in a magazine or in any other place, so they will remain in the tomb where they intended to be buried as their house of eternity. In a post-COVID world, we hope to return to all of these lovely people who've made our work a joy over the last several years. The Egyptian team members, led by Rais Omar Farouk, who always brings me the best excavators and the most fun team. The inspectors who help us as team members, who participate in every way that they can. The administrators and the officials, go out of their way to make us feel welcome and to help us however they can. So my thanks go out to the Ministry of Antiquities, as well as the workmen, the people of Luxor, all of those sort of factors that make doing field work in Egypt fun, as well as beneficial to research. And I really, really wish I could be there now. January is our normal field season time, and unfortunately, because of COVID, we can't be. So in the future, inshallah, we will see you again. Thank you.